Hello and welcome to G Fun Facts Online, the show that dives deep into the fascinating science behind our world. Today, we're tackling a question that feels like it's at the heart of almost every political debate and economic plan. What is the best way to grow an economy? Imagine you have a giant garden representing the economy. To make it flourish, do you sprinkle water on the tallest flowers and hope the drips find their way down to the roots? Or do you water the soil directly, nourishing the roots so the entire garden can thrive? This is the perfect analogy for one of the biggest showdowns in modern economics: trickle-down versus gush-up. One theory, formerly known as supply-side economics, argues that by cutting taxes on corporations and the wealthy, the tallest flowers, the benefits of investment and job creation will eventually trickle down to everyone. The opposing theory, often called middle-out or bottom-up economics, argues that true prosperity gushes up from the bottom. It says you should bolster the purchasing power of the middle and lower classes, the roots, because their spending is what truly nourishes the entire economic ecosystem. For the next 20 minutes, we're putting on our detective hats. We're going to investigate the intellectual origins of these dueling ideas, travel back in time to see them in action, and most importantly, we will sift through the cold, hard data to understand which method actually works. So get ready as we explore the great economic divide: trickle-down or gush-up. Let's start at the top of the pyramid with trickle-down economics. Now, that name itself, trickle-down, has a bit of a story. It wasn't invented by an economist in a university office. It's believed to have been popularized by the American humorist Will Rogers during the Great Depression. He used it as a joke to critique President Herbert Hoover's economic policies, saying money was all appropriated for the top, in hopes it would trickle down to the needy. As you can imagine, proponents of this theory absolutely despise the name. They prefer the much more academic-sounding term, supply-side economics. And that name gives us a huge clue. Supply-siders believe that to get an economy running at full speed, you have to focus on the supply of goods and services. The core logic goes like this: if you lower the tax burden on corporations and high-income earners, you give them both the incentive and the capital to invest. They'll use that extra money to build new factories, fund risky but innovative startups, and expand their businesses. This flurry of investment, in theory, creates a powerful chain reaction. It leads to more jobs. As companies compete for a limited pool of workers, they have to offer higher wages. Suddenly, the prosperity that started as a tax cut for the rich has trickled down to benefit all layers of society. It's a compelling narrative of unleashing the job creators. This philosophy isn't just about taxes. A crucial piece of the supply-side puzzle is deregulation. The idea is that removing government controls and red tape on industries will spur more competition, efficiency, and innovation. Now, if your central policy is cutting taxes, especially for the wealthy, you need a powerful justification, an idea that makes it seem not just plausible, but logical. For supply-siders, that killer app was the Laffer curve. The origin story of the Laffer curve is a legend in political circles. Picture the scene. It's 1974, a restaurant in Washington, D.C. An economist named Arthur Laffer is having dinner with a journalist and two rising political stars, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. To illustrate his point about taxes, Laffer reportedly grabbed a napkin and sketched a simple, U-shaped curve. The Laffer curve illustrates the relationship between tax rates and total tax revenue. At a 0% tax rate, the government collects nothing. That's obvious. At a 100% tax rate, the government also, theoretically, collects nothing, because nobody would have any incentive to earn a single dollar if it was all going to be taken away. Between these two extremes, the curve rises, hits a peak point of maximum revenue, and then begins to slope downwards. The explosive implication of this simple drawing is that if a country's tax rates are on the downward sloping part of that curve, if they are too high, then a tax cut could paradoxically lead to an increase in total government revenue. The cut would supposedly ignite such a firestorm of economic activity that the government would end up collecting more money in total from a bigger economic pie, even at a lower tax rate. This was a revolutionary idea, a tax cut that pays for itself. Of course, critics immediately pointed out the flaws. The Laffer curve is a neat theory, but in the real world, it's impossibly simplistic. Nobody agrees on where that peak revenue point actually is. Is it a 35% rate, 50%, 70%? And this raises an even more fundamental question. Should maximizing government revenue even be the primary goal of tax policy in the first place? But despite the criticisms, the Laffer curve's elegant simplicity was politically potent. It laid the intellectual foundation for perhaps the most famous and widespread application of supply-side theory, Reaganomics. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, the United States was in a miserable economic funk called stagflation, a toxic combination of stagnant growth and painfully high inflation. Reagan promised a radical new approach based on 4 pillars: reducing the growth of government spending, cutting federal income taxes, reducing regulation, and tightening the money supply to crush inflation. He pushed through 2 landmark tax bills. The first, in 1981, was a massive cut, lowering the top marginal income tax rate from 70% down to 50%. The second, in 1986, brought that top rate down even further to just 28%, though it also simplified the code and eliminated many loopholes. So what happened? Supporters of Reaganomics hail it as a resounding success. They point to the economic boom of the 1980s. Inflation was tamed, falling from a sky-high 13.5% in 1980 to a manageable 4.1% by 1988. The economy created a staggering 20 million new jobs. They argue that Reagan's policies unleashed the entrepreneurial spirit of America. But critics offer a starkly different interpretation. They point out that during Reagan's presidency, the national debt tripled, soaring from less than $1 trillion to nearly $3 trillion. The gap between the rich and the poor, which had been narrowing for decades, began to widen dramatically. And that magical idea of tax cuts paying for themselves? It didn't happen. The 1981 cuts resulted in a 6% drop in real-term revenues, forcing the administration to pass a tax increase in 1982 to stabilize government finances. The trickle-down experiment has been repeated several times since, under President George W. Bush in the 2000s and President Donald Trump in 2017. And it wasn't just an American phenomenon. In the UK, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was Reagan's ideological counterpart, implementing similar policies. So if that's the trickle-down story, what is the alternative? Let's flip the economic pyramid on its head and talk about gush-up economics. This approach, also known as middle-out or bottom-up, finds its hero in one of the 20th century's most influential economists, John Maynard Keynes. Keynesian economics, forged in the crucible of the Great Depression, argues that the true driver of an economy is not supply, but aggregate demand, the total spending on goods and services by consumers, businesses, and government. Before Keynes, classical economics held that supply creates its own demand. But during the Great Depression, that idea was collapsing in real time. Factories were perfectly capable of producing goods, and millions of people were desperate for work. The problem wasn't a lack of supply. It was a catastrophic lack of demand because no one had any money to buy anything. The central idea of gush-up economics is that if you want to get an economy moving, you have to put money into the hands of the people who will actually spend it. And that means the middle and lower classes. Think of it as a virtuous cycle. A middle-class family gets a tax credit or a wage increase. They use that money to finally buy a new washing machine. The appliance store sees sales go up and orders more machines from the factory. The factory then has to hire one more worker to keep up with the new orders. That newly hired worker now has a paycheck, which they use to buy groceries and clothes for their kids. This creates more business for the grocery store and the clothing store, who might then need to hire more staff. Prosperity gushes up from the broad base of the population, creating a self-sustaining cycle of demand, production, and hiring. This represents a fundamental split from supply-side thinking. Supply-siders say government should get out of the way. Keynesians say that during an economic downturn, it is the government's duty to step in and stimulate demand. A key concept supporting this view is the marginal propensity to consume. It's a fancy term for a simple idea. For every extra dollar someone gets, how much of it do they spend? A billionaire who gets an extra $1,000 is unlikely to change their spending habits. That money likely goes straight into savings or an investment account. But for a family living paycheck to paycheck, an extra $1,000 is a game changer. It gets spent almost immediately on necessities and deferred purchases. Their marginal propensity to consume is much, much higher. Gush-Up theorists argue this makes stimulus for the middle class a far more efficient and effective way to boost the economy. We've seen this approach in action too. The most famous example is President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. It responded to the Great Depression with huge public works projects, like the Works Progress Administration and Civilian Conservation Corps, putting millions to work building the roads, bridges, and parks we still use today. It created social safety nets like Social Security. The goal was always to increase mass purchasing power to revive demand. Today, modern Gush-Up policies include things like raising the minimum wage, expanding the earned income tax credit for working families, and making public investments in education and infrastructure. So, we have two powerful, competing theories. One says help the investors at the top, the other says help the spenders in the middle. But this isn't just a battle of ideas. For decades, economists have been poring over the data. What really happens when you try these things? Let's start with that core promise of trickle-down, that tax cuts for the rich will supercharge economic growth for everyone. The evidence on this front is overwhelmingly disappointing for supply-siders. A 2019 study in the prestigious Journal of Political Economy found that while tax cuts aimed at lower-income groups did boost employment, the effect of tax cuts for the top 10% on job growth was negligible. But an even bigger bombshell came in 2020. Researchers at the London School of Economics in King's College London conducted a massive study analyzing 50 years of major tax cuts for the rich across 18 developed countries, including the US and UK. Their conclusion was stark. These tax cuts had no significant effect on economic growth or unemployment. The economy did not grow faster, and it did not create more jobs. So if the money wasn't creating jobs or growing the economy, where did it go? This brings us to the impact on income inequality. Here, the data tells an unambiguous story. The LSE study found one very clear result of cutting taxes on the rich. The rich got richer, a lot richer. In the years following major tax cuts, the share of national income held by the top 1% of earners consistently shot up. This aligns perfectly with the experience of the 1980s, which kicked off a multi-decade trend of widening inequality. A defender of this system might say some inequality is the price of a dynamic economy, but a growing body of research shows that extreme inequality can actually be a drag on growth. It can depress consumer demand and lead to a less healthy, less educated workforce, which hurts a country's long-term potential. Finally, what about that beautiful promise of the Laffer curve, that tax cuts pay for themselves? Here again, real-world evidence is brutal. The 1981 Reagan cuts were followed by a revenue drop. More recently, a famous real-world experiment in the state of Kansas in 2012, where Governor Sam Brownback enacted massive trickle-down tax cuts, led to catastrophic budget shortfalls and cuts to essential services, with no promised economic boom. The policy was so disastrous that the state's own Republican-led legislature eventually voted to reverse it. So where does all this leave us? The debate between trickle-down and gush-up economics is incredibly complex, and it will surely continue. But after decades of real-world experiments, a clear pattern has emerged from the data. The central promise of trickle-down economics, that cutting taxes on the wealthy will create broad-based prosperity, has not been fulfilled. These policies are remarkably effective at increasing the wealth of those already at the top, but their positive effects on overall economic growth and employment appear to be limited at best, and they consistently lead to a rise in income inequality. On the other hand, the theory of gush-up economics, that a financially secure middle class is the true engine of growth, is supported by a growing mountain of evidence. Policies that increase the purchasing power of average families appear more effective at stimulating the demand that creates a robust, stable, and more equitable economy for everyone. Ultimately, the choice between these two approaches isn't just about economic models. It's a choice of values. It's about the kind of story we want to tell about how our society works. Is prosperity a rare commodity created by a handful of job creators at the top? Or is it something we build together, from the ground up? The story we choose to believe has profound consequences for every single one of us. Thanks for tuning in to G Fun Facts Online.